Ladies and gentlemen, with AMD's launch of Ryzen, the tech market rejoiced at the prospect of bringing competition back into the marketplace. This very same marketplace which Intel had enjoyed dominance in so completely for a number of years. It's hard to argue against the sheer value AMD's Ryzen 7, for example, brought to content creators who relied on high core count and performance for video editing and 3D rendering, but that's not to say that many gamers were not happy to invest too. But game performance was a bit of a mixed bag, and while many titles ran virtually indistinguishably from an equivalent Intel Skylake or Kaby Lake rig, particularly in higher resolution / GPU bound scenarios, certain titles just didn't perform as well as to be expected. Rise of the Tomb Raider was one of those biggest culprits. With the fact the game was DX12, gamers just expected Ryzen to excel, and this just simply wasn't the case. Frame rates were just not a few percent lower, but instead massively lower, and there was a lot of speculation as to the cause. Driver or BIOS issues in Ryzen, a fault in the CPU's design even perhaps, poorly optimized software as the CPUs were so new, and some even levied the blame at Nvidia for causing it, with perhaps accusations that drivers were holding Ryzen's performance back. My name is Paul, and in this RedGaming.com video, we're going to be investigating a recently released patch for Rise of the Tomb Raider, which touts itself as improving performance for Ryzen, and show this patch, which by the way has very much flown under the radar of many of the mainstream gaming press, demonstrate that yes, much of Ryzen's performance are optimization related for the software it's running. For point of reference, here's the specs of the machine we're using: a Ryzen 5 1600X and a B350, the CPU clocked at 3.6 GHz, the RAM at 2667. This is not top of the line Ryzen 7 in a high-end X370 board, and that is the point. We wanted to see how a cheaper Ryzen 7 could compete. We'll be doing more testing with a Ryzen 7 in the future, but just know that the GPU here was a GTX 1080 clocked at the default, in other words stock clocks. Improved DirectX 12 performance across a variety of hardware in CPU bound situations, especially performance at AMD's Ryzen 7 CPUs can significantly be improved. This is what the patch notes in patch 1.0.770 states, and handily you can use the Steam beta opt-in feature to go back to a previous version. I decided to play around with this a bit and do a little testing. I feel the results speak for themselves. Frame rates are now pretty much identical for the Ryzen 5 versus the 6700K, for example, and demonstrate that yes, BIOS updates have seen significant improvement in Ryzen along with the drivers, but all the BIOS updates in the world can't do all the work by themselves. Instead, what we have here is a clear demonstration that it was Rise of the Tomb Raider which was at fault when it was created, and to be clear, I'm not blaming Crystal Dynamics. No one can expect a company to optimize for an architecture, Ryzen in this case, which was not available upon the game's release. So, what does all of this mean? Well, the bad news is that unfortunately, such updates do fly under the radar, and thus people tend to remember the first results, the poorer results. And it was obvious to many that something was off with Rise of the Tomb Raider when it came to Ryzen's benchmarks, and many suspected they just simply ignore those benchmarks, that folks just don't run those benchmarks when testing Ryzen. But to me, that's not the best way to handle this, as if you get an average customer who then buys the game and does run it and then wonders, why are my frame rates like 40 FPS lower or what have you compared to an Intel rig, then obviously they're going to be kind of pissed. It's better instead to point out the fault, but say, hey, here's the results, we're pretty sure that something's up, something should be done soon to fix this, right? Because then it pushes AMD to, bother developers, and developers to kind of delve into the results and puts pressure on everyone to provide us better performance. This is a very similar story for Ashes of the Singularity, where escalation saw a huge performance bump thanks to Ryzen optimization. After all, the job of anyone doing benchmarking and putting those results out into the world is to inform customers, to inform users who are thinking of buying that. Therefore, it's better to say, hey, we think these results are because of errors, or perhaps, the game not being optimized or what have you, they're erroneous, but we're honest with the results because that's kind of how to do things. The best way to describe a reviewer, after all, is not as service to a developer or a hardware creator, instead it's to their viewer or their reader. But the good news is that Ryzen performance is improving, and even if you are an Intel owner or supporter, here's why Ryzen doing well is a good thing. As recent news from Intel on the Basin Falls, for example, shows that the company now understand they're no longer able to just be complacent. Thus, we get better choice as customers, whether you want to support Intel, whether you want to support AMD, or whether you're just plumb buying the best hardware you can for the money. And frankly, I think the latter of those options, buying the best you can for the dosh you've got, is always the best policy. With all of that said, take care of yourselves and subscribe if you like this video. Bye for now.